Okay, hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to the second part of the series of discussion. Today we are going to cover the topic of sanctions against Russia with Viktor Szép. Viktor originally is a member of our institute, but at the moment he is a postdoctoral researcher in Netherlands at the University of Groningen. So first of all, Viktor, thank you so much for being with us today. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And before we begin, I would like to share some technical information. According to the plans, Viktor will talk about his topic for 40 or 45 minutes, and then everybody can ask. So if you have questions, please raise your hand, or you can use the chat box as well. Second, I would like to inform you that we are recording this discussion, but only the presentation, so only the first 40 or 45 minutes, and we are not going to record the questions and comments. And third, please do not forget that on Thursday we will continue this series of discussions with John Sabo, who will talk about the topic of energy policy regarding this war, this conflict. So feel free to join. And now, then let's begin. So Viktor, the stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. And first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. Once again, it's great to see familiar faces, of course, colleagues and all, some familiar students as well. I see some names. So welcome and great to see you once again, of course, online, but we are quite used to this format. Anyway, I hope you will enjoy the presentation. As Attila said, and I hope you can see the my slides. I'm currently working at the University of Groningen. For those of you who speak in Dutch, of course, my pronunciation is not correct. I know that this is for me it's unpronounceable, but let's stick to this. University of Groningen, and on the left side, left top side, you can see the Engage project, which is perhaps interesting for you. This Engage project is a European Union funded project, and we are working on EU foreign policy and EU external actions, and we are looking at the possibilities of how to enhance the capabilities of the European Union, how to take more effective steps at the international stage. And I think this is a very topical issue. Of course, there are many sad developments, as you perhaps probably you have also followed the news in Ukraine, but it's a very topical issue. And today I'm going to talk basically, as Attila said, about international sanctions and more specifically about European Union sanctions. So what I'm going to do is that basically I have two chapters today, or two windows, if you like. One, basic notions in EU sanctions policy, but I'm going to promise you that I'm not going to spend many time with the basics, just to make sure that we are on the same page. And in the second phase, I'm going to specifically talk about sanctions and how those sanctions came about, why those sanctions are important, and what are the implications of those sanctions against Russia. And of course, at the very end of the presentation, I'm more than happy to answer your questions on sanctions. So let's start. So EU sanctions policy, the basics. Whenever we are talking about European Union sanctions, we often refer to restrictive measures. So in the European Union, the official notion for sanctions is restrictive measures. Just to let you know, whenever you open a European Union website and you face this notion, restrictive measures, those are basically the sanctions of the European Union. And those sanctions are always decided within the so-called Common Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union, the CFSP. The CFSP is the foreign policy platform of the European Union, and it is a so-called intergovernmental cooperation of the European Union, where you have the member states, and they are usually voting by unanimity in this CFSP. As you can see, whenever there are sanctions on the table, proposals for sanctions are always coming either from the European External Action Service. For those of you who are not familiar with the European Union, the European External Action Service is basically the foreign ministry of the European Union, if you want, or the Commission. So those are the two actors that are proposing sanctions. And then the Council decides. It means that practically that the member states decide by unanimity. So you can imagine the situation in the European Union. What happens is that's very slow usually. What you can see is that the member states, negotiate with each other, and it's not easy because they have to reconcile all the interests that are in Brussels. So it's not easy negotiations. But anyway, you can see, according to the latest statistics, that 80% of CFSP decisions, or if you want to simplify things, 80% of EU foreign policy decisions are about sanctions. So what I want to say is that sanctions are increasingly used by the European Union to tackle challenges. If you look at the Syrian case, if you look at the Iranian case, you look at the Russian case, you can see that the European Union increasingly uses sanctions to tackle all these challenges. Now, let me talk about briefly what are targeted sanctions. That is one of the most important notions when it comes to EU sanctions policy, because it means that the European Union doesn't use, complete embargoes against third states. It only uses targeted sanctions. It means that whenever the European Union imposes sanctions, it either targets individuals or entities responsible for certain actions that are, of course, not accepted by the European Union or by certain international actors. The reason why you have only targeted sanctions is that when you apply full embargoes against third states, well, you can see that there are devastating consequences, and you might have serious humanitarian consequences of those sanctions. This is why the European Union and also the UN and also the US only uses, for the last couple of decades, only targeted sanctions. When it comes to the types of sanctions, there are different types, actually. When you just reading news in the Financial Times, Economist, or maybe Hungarian media outlets, you can see that, titles like the European Union imposed sanctions, tack, and the European Union has imposed that sanctions, and that, and tack. So it's really simplified. But in reality, the picture is more complex because you have different types of sanctions. The European Union can impose travel bans, asset freezes, as you can see on the slide, different arms embargoes, trade sanctions, financial sanctions, diplomatic restrictions, and all different kinds of sanctions. And I will talk about these ones and specifically what types of sanctions have been imposed against Russia. My last point in this slide, the implementation, very quickly. There are basically three types of sanctions in that regard. At the top level, if you want, you have UN sanctions. When the UN Security Council decides to impose sanctions against third states, then, what happens is that the European Union also imposes sanctions because this is basically an international law obligation. Of course, if you're asking me the question whether you have UN sanctions against Russia, of course, the answer is no, because Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And of course, Russia will not vote in favor of any sanction that would be imposed against it itself. Then second, the so-called UN plus sanctions. It happens when the United Nations imposed sanctions, but the European Union decides to go beyond those sanctions and impose extra additional sanctions to the UN sanctions. And finally, you have the so-called European Union autonomous measures. They exist when there is no agreement at the UN level, so there is no UN Security Council resolution. Then still the European Union can impose sanctions, and this is what happened in the case of the current crisis. Now, this is also part of the introduction, but I'm going to be very quick on that. So sanctions, what are basically sanctions? Sanctions are foreign policy instruments. Okay, that's very important to point out, because there is some misunderstanding that sanctions are used in commercial disputes, and in reality, not really. Sanctions are usually used to achieve foreign and security policy objectives. Of course, sanctions usually take the form of commercial and financial instruments, but they are nearly always used to achieve foreign and security policy objectives, right? So, you can impose sanctions to deter certain actors to do something wrong. You can use also sanctions to change the target country behavior if it is unacceptable, and so on and so forth. Okay, that was the first point. The second point is that sanctions are rarely used alone, because by imposing sanctions, you can rarely achieve good results. So what happens usually, and this is also what happens in the case of Ukraine, is that you have a number of foreign policy instruments which are used in parallel. So sanctions are deployed, that's one thing. But at the same time, as you can see in the case of the Ukraine, there are many foreign policy instruments that are being used in parallel. So, for example, you can see the use of weapons, where some countries are sending weapons to Ukraine. Of course, there are the question of the refugees. What happens with refugees? How the European Union can help with the refugees? How the European Union can step up and support financially Ukraine? There is a humanitarian side. There is a medical assistance side. There is also a talk about EU accession, the possible accession of Ukraine into the European Union. Of course, that's a big question, but that's also part of a bigger strategy, right? So sanctions are one type of foreign policy instrument, but sanctions are never or almost never used as a standalone instrument, always combined with other foreign policy instruments, because then you can have more success. And yeah, just a final sentence. Sanctions are mostly effective when they are multilateral. It means that, when there is one country, the UK, I don't know, France, maybe the US, and it wants to achieve something big with sanctions, well, that's always questionable. But when there is a support from several countries, the European Union, the US, perhaps other states, Japan, Singapore, and other countries joining that same sanctions regime, then you have more chance to succeed to achieve your objectives with sanctions. Quickly, I think that's an interesting statistics showing you, and I hope you can see this in a big screen. So here you can see the number of sanctions imposed by the European Union in the last 3 decades. And you can see that in 1990, you had something like 1 or 2 sanctions regime. Now you have 30-something sanctions regime of the European Union. So once again, increasingly, the European Union imposes sanctions to tackle different kinds of security challenges. If you want to see the big picture, that's also impressive. You can see that the US with deep blue, and then UN sanctions, and then European Union sanctions are the in 2/3 of the cases, these are either US sanctions, UN sanctions, or European Union sanctions. In other words, it means what you can see here is that most of the sanctions are imposed by one of these actors, and 1/3 of the sanctions are imposed by the rest of the world. So the European Union and the US, and of course the UN, are the front runners when it comes to sanctions, and they are increasingly using that instrument to achieve big foreign policy objectives. Okay, that was the basics. Now let's turn our attention to the case of Russia, and please tell me if I'm a little bit fast in explaining how EU sanctions policy works. Of course, I just wanted to give you a short introduction, but now I think it would be nice to talk about the current case. So if you look at how the European Union and Russian relations have evolved during the past 3 decades, and how what role sanctions played in that relationship, you can say that during the Georgian War, so until 2008, and of course until 2014, there were no major sanctions. So I don't have time to explain you the Chechen wars and the Georgian war. I just want to tell you that those moments in the 90s and also in the Georgian war in 2008 were, major setbacks in EU-Russia relations, and all those crises raised the question whether the European Union needs to impose sanctions or not. And until the Georgian war, the European Union answer was always no, at least not CFSP sanctions. But instead, you cannot argue. On the other hand, you cannot argue that that the European Union wouldn't impose any sanctions. If you look at the Chechen wars, you can see that the so-called Partnership and Cooperation Agreement, which was a trade agreement between the European Union and Russia, was suspended, or the European Union postponed the ratification when the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement didn't exist. So that is also some kind of sanction if you understand sanctions broadly, when there are trade instruments but are either withheld or maybe not used because there are some foreign policy considerations in the game. In the Georgian war, it's very interesting to talk about the Georgian case because the same happened. I mean, in the sense that France was the rotating president in the Council of the European Union back in 2008, and also today. And Nicolas Sarkozy, the former French president, went to talk with President Medvedev to have negotiations with Russia. And when he came back to Brussels, he said that, well, that's really a fundamental issue, but well, we shouldn't impose sanctions anyway. So what I want to say to you is that until 2008, well, you could see that the European Union was a little bit reluctant to impose sanctions against Russia for many reasons. But 2014, a game changer. What happens in 2014? Well, 2 things. Number 1, the annexation of Crimea. The Crimean Peninsula is annexed by Russia. Number 2, the destabilization of eastern Ukraine. These 2 things, combined with the fact that there was an airline that was shot down, those actions triggered the European Union to impose, quite a number of sanctions. As you can see in this slide, the European Union back in 2014 decided to impose sanctions in 3 phases. Number 1 phase, suspended the Russian membership in the G8. Now it's G7 since then, as I guess you know given that you study international relations. And then there was a suspension of talks on visa and a possible new trade agreement replacing the old partnership and cooperation agreement with Russia. And then there was a second phase after the annexation of Crimea. Travel ban and freezing of assets, 21 persons. That was at that time, that was not a big number. By the end of 2019, you could see that there were 170 persons and 44 entities on the Russian list. Just to give you an idea of how many people and entities are now on the list, now you have 700. So there is a big boom in Russian sanctions, and but we will talk about this one. So it started as a phased approach. The European Union only imposed sanctions incrementally, if you want, slowly and gradually turning to, and this is the third phase in 2014, what happens after the downing of the MH17. So that was the Malaysian airline. Citizens traveled, mostly Dutch citizens traveled on this airline, flying through Ukraine, and that was shot down. And after that, the European Union decided to really step up and to impose financial restrictions, sectoral sanctions. As you can see, the European Union decided to restrict the EU capital, the access to EU capital markets to Russia, arms embargo, dual-use exports controls, limitations on technologies to deep water oil exploration, and the prohibition of new investment in Crimea and Sevastopol. That was in 2014. But you can, of course, ask the question, was it a big sanctions regime? Was it just a low-key sanctions regime? Well, the answer is that sanctions experts agree that if you look at the Iranian case, which was a maximum pressure campaign against Iran, and if you rate the Iranian case to 10 out of 10, then you can see that those sanctions against Russia, at least in 2014, was something like 2 or maybe 3 out of 10. So of course that those sanctions were problematic for Russia for a number of reasons. I don't have time to elaborate on that, but those sanctions at least compared to Iran was, well, so back in 2014. Just another slide showing you that that this, what I was talking about, happened in 2014. And if you ask the question, what happened between 2014 and 2022, you can see that the European Union imposed several other types of sanctions against Russia, but for a number of different reasons. So the European Union invented the so-called horizontal sanctions regime meanwhile. Horizontal sanctions regime are different from the traditional sanctions regime because traditional sanctions regimes, target states, target Iran, target Venezuela, target Russia, target Belarus, and so on and so forth. Horizontal sanctions regime, on the other hand, don't specifically mention a specific state, but instead targets individuals and entities irrespective of their geographical location. And it's politically less sensitive because you don't have to, label that this sanctions regime is against a particular country. And, if you're in the European Union, if you're in Brussels and you have 27 member states, well, it's difficult to negotiate and come to an agreement. And therefore, the horizontal sanctions regime offered you a solution to, to a little bit ease the unanimity requirement in EU foreign policy, because you avoid the situation to name a certain country, name and shame a country. And therefore, if you look at now, you have a human rights sanctions regime. Now you have a chemical weapons sanctions regime. Now you have a cyber attack sanctions regime. one of the commonalities in the sanctions regime that in each type of the sanctions regime, you have Russian names and entities. I don't have time. If maybe if you have questions on these sanctions, then I'm happy to answer or on the details, but just wanted to let you know that before 2022, there were different types of sanctions against Russia for a number of reasons: human rights issues, the use of chemical weapons, and because of cyber attacks. Okay, let's turn our attention to today's sanctions. So I had recently the question of why, so if you follow the news on sanctions, you could see that the European Union was very fast, wasn't it? It was very fast. You know, the European Union is known of being slow. You know, usually the European Union is very slow. 27 member states, you know, different institutions, different interests, different, in some cases, different regional interests, and so on and so forth. But this time, the European Union was very, very fast. And so one of the reasons of this speedy action was the Transatlantic Coordination that took place between, of course, the United States and the European Union. So this Transatlantic Coordination was almost a never seen Transatlantic Coordination. Of course, if you look at the past, the highest level of cooperation happened with the case of Iran and Russia. If you ask me the question, what's the difference between the Iranian sanctions regime and the Russian sanctions regime? Well, one of the fundamental differences is that in the case of Iran, you had a UN Security Council resolution, and the European Union went beyond those resolutions and pushed hard the Iranian regime, to give up its nuclear program. And therefore, you had this JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, right? That's a complicated story. We can also talk about this in the Q&A session, but I wanted to say to you that, you know, the US withdrew from that JCPOA in 2018. That was a major blow in the Iranian sanctions case. But anyway, just wanted to let you know that there was a major cooperation in the Iranian case. In the Russian case back in 2014, you can see John Smith, the former OFAC director. The OFAC is the body that in the US that is responsible for sanctions implementation and sanctions enforcement. So John Smith talked about the fact back in 2014 that, well, this cooperation, hadn't happened in the past. You can see the quote from John Smith talking about, this is a quote: "We shared a respected targeting list, something we had never done before, so that each side at the end of the Atlantic knew generally what the other side intended to do next." So what I want to say that immense cooperation between the two sides on the Iranian and Russian case, and especially today, I mean nowadays. If you perhaps closely follow the events, you could see that few months ago, the US and the European Union threatened Russia to impose sanctions against it if it invades Ukraine. Yeah, this is what happened. And during this time, the US and the European Union closely worked with each other so that once, perhaps, back at the time, invasion happens, immediately those actors can impose sanctions. And this is precisely what happened. Yeah, so deep cooperation, an enhanced cooperation, if you want, happened because of the need to coordinate those measures. Okay, I will not talk about this one. This is a little bit complicated. I want you to show you just this. Whenever the European Union imposes sanctions, alongside perhaps with the US, they rarely do it alone. There are many countries that join their efforts. You can see the case of the UK, but other European states as well. You can see Switzerland joining the European Union in sanctions regime. Switzerland that that is always very keen on its neutrality, always very careful in its approach on how to implement different sanctions and how to approach different states. Well, Switzerland also joined the sanctions, but usually what happens is that in Europe, candidate states, potential candidate states, Norway, Iceland, and all the other countries join the European Union in sanctions. So whenever the European Union imposes sanctions, it's not only about 27 member states. It's much more than that. It's the European continent, plus US, plus Canada, plus Australia, plus Japan, and so on and so forth. So there are a big number of countries that usually are aligned when it comes to sanctions. Okay, in practical terms, 2022, I guess I have 10 minutes left before the Q&A or something like this. So as I said to you, this was a very intense transatlantic cooperation between the US and the European Union. You can see a quote from Richard Nephew. He's a well-known analyst in sanctions policy, who basically argues that you can't really imagine how hard it is to coordinate sanctions matters. Because of different things. I just want to let you know that there are multilateral forms of cooperation. You have multilateral G7 at the level of G7. The US and the European Union cooperate in sanctions matter, but of course there are bilateral links as well. And those sanctions were prepared by the European Union and by the US. And one of the main aims of this preparation is to have a deterrence effect. Of course, if you ask me the question whether deterrence, succeeded, of course not. Sanctions failed to have a deterrent effect. Sanctions were, with the use of sanctions, the EU and the US were unable to prevent this war from happening. But at the same time, the use of sanctions can have other purposes. As you can see, the US and European economies combined are more than 20% as large as Russia's economy. So when they are together and they decide to impose tough measures, then it can have devastating impact, even if those measures, as we discussed, are targeted measures. I talked about the last point about the fact that the European Union was very quick, very speedy. It doesn't mean that there were no disagreements. There were some disagreements. If you look at the Polish case, Poland argued to further elaborate the SWIFT sanctions and to include more banks in the SWIFT sanctions. And there was also a question of, freedom of speech when it comes to the Russian Today and Sputnik. That was raised by one of the EU commissioners. So there were some dilemmas, but at the end, the European Union was very fast in imposing sanctions against Russia. Okay. So I want to show you the sanctions. When I started for this preparation, I tried to copy and paste all the sanctions that were imposed against Russia. And I can tell you that there are so many sanctions against Russia that I wasn't even able to copy and paste all of them. So I decided just to give you a sense of what happened. So there are many different types of sanctions that are now being imposed against Russia. If you look at, and I hope you can see on the slide, I know that the letters are quite small, but if you look at this list, you can see that there are travel bans against members of the Russian State Duma, asset freezes, even against Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, sanctions against members of National Security Council, and many others. export bans, ban on the sale of all aircraft, spare parts and equipment, and so on and so forth. I wouldn't be able to enumerate all of them. What I want you to focus on is the major sanctions, is the financial sanctions that have been imposed, and in some sense that was unprecedented. Unprecedented because the Russian central bank was also targeted, which happened only in the case of Iran and Venezuela. It's a very unique sanctions regime in the sense that it targeted the Russian central bank, and those financial sanctions that are in red color, really affects Russia's ability to finance itself and finance some of its actions. So I will concentrate on some financial sanctions and the SWIFT. Okay. So first of all, and I guess I have, Attila, correct me if I'm wrong, but I have 5 minutes left or something like this, or 10, 5?
Let's say 10.
10, okay, I will stick to 10 minutes. So if you ask me the question, why financial sanctions and why not trade sanctions? The answer is quite easy. Of course, that was one of the dilemmas of the policymakers. Trade sanctions or financial sanctions. What kind of sanctions should the European Union impose? And the answer was financial. Why financial sanctions? Because if you look at the second part of this slide, you can see that if you target Russian official reserves, the Russian foreign assets of banks, oligarch foreign assets and corporate assets, so you target banks and you apply a full blocking sanctions, then you can see that it's over $1 trillion. It's a sum that you can't even imagine. It's a big number, yeah? Whereas if you look at the daily export income, it's much less. It's much, much less. And trade sanctions affect only the smaller flow of future income. So it's different. So this was one of the reasons to target really the financial sector and really target the Russian central bank. I will also show you something else. Look at this picture. This picture is I think it's very telling in the sense that here you can see the Bank of Russia foreign exchange and gold assets. You can see that the majority, or at least a big chunk of these assets were either in euro, in deep blue, or in US dollar, or in pound. So what you can see that all of those got sanctioned. All of those is completely out of control from the Russian perspective. So it's an immense shock for the Russia's finances. Why is it so special? Well, it's the most punitive penalty, if you want. It's not the SWIFT. SWIFT is often raised as the nuclear option of sanctions. In fact, SWIFT is not the nuclear option of sanctions. The very big sanctions is targeting the Russian central bank, is targeting the foreign assets of Russia. And I tell you why. When you have foreign assets, it helps you as a state to intervene in your currency. If you have some trouble, then you can have, foreign assets in US dollars, you have euro, you have, in pounds, and so on and so forth. You can get instant access to those assets if you have a domestic financial problem. And in this case, the Russians no longer can access to their foreign assets. You can see the exact numbers as well in the middle of this slide. In Russia, that was $630 billion. I mean, the total foreign reserve, and much of these foreign reserves, something like 300, are now being sanctioned. And the Russian state cannot use to intervene, when the ruble is falling, cannot use to help the Russian economy and finance to protect itself, basically. And you know, those reserves can also be used when you are sanctioned. But given that if those foreign reserves were also sanctions, Russia can no longer access to this foreign reserve and cannot use to help the ruble and help its financial system with other means. Here you have a quote also from Daniel Glaser, and you know, this is what he said, and I think it's completely right. You know, and this is a quote: "It's a direct attempt to strike at Russia's ability to weather out sanctions, because the way they would weather out sanctions is by relying on their reserves. The less control they have over their reserves, or the less they could do with their reserves, the more vulnerable to the second round of pressure they become." So they cannot access those foreign reserves. They cannot protect themselves with them. So this is really what hits Russia's ability to finance itself. And of course, you can see that it has an impact not only at state level, but also at individual level. You can see, you know, in the media, you can see people in front of ATMs trying to get their money, but they have, of course, difficulties in getting their money because, you know, banks are currently under sanctions, and their assets are also under sanctions. So it has a major impact on the financial system of Russia. I think I have 29 slides, but this will be the last one because I guess I will no longer have time. I just wanted to talk about the SWIFT option. You know, that back in 2014, that was basically off the table, completely off the table. So this was something that, you know, some countries advocated, but at the end, you know, the majority of the member states said that, well, that would be tough. That would be tough. So what is the SWIFT sanctions? Because we talk a lot about SWIFT sanctions, but we usually have the feeling that nobody understands what SWIFT sanctions is. So SWIFT is basically a messaging system, okay? SWIFT is a messaging system. It has nothing to do with, financial transactions, in the sense that that if you're off the SWIFT, you can still, you know, make transactions, but not through the SWIFT. One of the advantages of the SWIFT that it is worldwide. As you can see, 11,000 financial institutions are connected to the SWIFT with over 200 countries. So SWIFT makes your life easier. If you have access to SWIFT, then you can have easy communications with the other banks, and then you can make transactions. If you're not connected, it doesn't mean that you cannot make transactions. You can, but it's much more difficult. It has more costs. It's slower. This is something that you want to avoid. You want to use SWIFT, yeah? And you could see that the SWIFT sanctions is also being used. 7 Russian banks are excluded from the SWIFT, but you know, the compromise in the European Union was that Russia's largest bank, the Sberbank and the Gazprom Bank, are still in the SWIFT, and the reason is that you know, it is very much related to the gas deal and the energy in general, so that Europe can still pay to Russia and vice versa. Because otherwise it would be much difficult, as I previously said to you. Final thought. Of course, given that SWIFT was, you know, kind of on the table since 8 years, Russia started to create its own, system. This is called the System for the Transmission of Financial Messages. Does it replace SWIFT? Well, so. Because if you compare with SWIFT, you can see that, you know, for the Russian system, you have 400 financial institutions. SWIFT, 11,000. You could see that in the Russian system, there were 13 million messages per year. In the SWIFT, 7.8 billion messages a year. So it's not the same. You can use your own system. You can develop your own system. Like China also is currently developing its own system, but it's much less effective. It's much less known. It's much much less actors are involved in those financial institutions. So the Russians are trying to have their own system, but it's at the moment it cannot replace the SWIFT. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to basically stop here. I have many more slides, but if you have some questions, I'm happy to answer those questions. And of course, thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much, Viktor, for your very interesting lecture and your really informative slides. I think we all enjoyed your presentation. So, questions and comments, but before that, I am going to stop recording the video. So